All right, well, my clock says 11:02, so I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. This is the second webinar in our autumn webinar series. We have one left in December. Today, we are talking about assessment, insights, and analysis. Prove your impact. My name is Stephanie Ray. I am the Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Continual Care Solutions. All right, so rather than me tell you about Continual Care, I'm going to share with you our recently created video. It's very short, it's 30 seconds. I'm going to play it for you that explains a little bit about our company. It is on our homepage. I would welcome you to share it with others as a way to tell people about us. Here we go.
Do you have the technology you need to serve your clients with excellence? Continual Care Solutions has built Empower, an enterprise software system specifically for human services. We consolidate data from multiple sources into one system, streamline processes so you can operate more efficiently, and manage your clients' well-being through a comprehensive electronic social record. We'd love to talk with you about how we can help you advance your mission. Dee?
Okay, so here's what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to talk about getting paid for the services you provide, why human services organizations are giving away services for free and how to change that. Second, we're going to review implementing assessments at the program level, capture before and after status to demonstrate outcomes that funders want to see. And lastly, we'll go to the organizational level where we'll explore multiple options for tracking point-in-time organizational health to identify areas of needed focus. So let's start with why are organizations giving away their services for free? And some of you on the webinar might be wondering, well, what are you talking about? Who gives away their services for free? Well, likely, if you're in a human services organization, the answer is all of you. And we're going to talk about why. The first is not recognized as services. Second, not aware services are being performed. And three, not collecting data to demonstrate outcomes. So I'm going to explain each of these in turn. So first, the problem is not recognized services. So the people performing these services regard them as things they do for clients that are related to other services. So what am I talking about here? So let's imagine a direct support professionals or, for example, a job counselor, right, who helps a client with resume preparation in order to help them get a job. And that is a service, the resume prep, that you get reimbursed for as an organization. Okay, that's great. But your job counselor has decided that it's actually more effective to also prepare the client for interviews. So they spend 30 minutes before every interview, reviewing questions with them, going over behavioral interview questions, interview etiquette, etc. So they took it upon themselves to provide this very value-added service, which is wonderful, except you're not getting paid for it. So it's not sustainable in the long term. So you end up having well-meaning, person-centered staff who are passionate about serving clients, yay, but they often ignore the opportunity cost of providing excellent support that is disassociated with any incoming revenue. So what's the solution for that? It is to educate your staff. So first of all, the solution is not to tell them to stop providing the free service, at least in my humble opinion and experience in human services myself. Okay, you want to continue to encourage them to provide this value-added service, but you got to find a way to get paid for it. The way to do that is to acknowledge this free service as separate, meaning related but distinct from the existing reimbursed service. Okay, so let's stay with the same example. If you're doing interview preparation, do not bundle that into resume prep. Separate that as a thing that happens on its own, but is related to the service. Then you need to measure that thing, meaning measure the outcome prompted by the interview prep, and we'll take it from there, okay, in order to pursue the funding. The next problem is not aware services are being performed, okay? So people who are most closely tied to funding administration for the program do not realize the services are being performed because those are not typically the same people who are providing the service. right? And the staff that are providing the service may be hesitant to openly share what they're doing because they may even realize that maybe it's free, or they realize that people don't know what they're doing and they're afraid they might get in trouble for it, which is, unfortunate, but people think that unless there's a mechanism that encourages and expects the staff to keep leaders informed about how they are providing the direct service to their clients. So the recommended solution then is to turn your staff into marketers, right? Let them shout from the rooftops about what they're doing. Do not rely solely on those in supervisory roles to tell the leadership team what's going on, right? Certainly they have a role to play, but in the hierarchy, if you're only getting your information from the supervisors, you may not be getting the direct information from the staff that's actually providing the service. So you need to explicitly encourage and set the expectation with your staff that they consistently keep you informed about the wonderful things they are doing for the clients. By the way, bonus, when you turn your staff into marketers, you get a lot more success stories in your repertoire that you can use from a fundraising and development perspective. And the last problem is not collecting data to demonstrate outcomes. So there's no data collected to demonstrate that these services are directly influencing measurable positive outcomes for clients. So you're sitting with the client, the job counselor is spending time with them, preparing them for the interview. It's making a huge difference in the jobs they're able to get, but nobody knows that because you're not collecting the data. One of the reasons you might not be doing that is because you're thinking about only the popular methods of collecting data, the objective measures, meaning things like counting, how many interviews maybe, but you're not actually taking a subjective view on interview readiness, because what does that mean? How do you assess that? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about. And it's important that you establish the baseline that can be used to measure progress over time. So the recommended solution, of course, in case you were wondering why you were here, is to implement assessments, okay? Caution is, do not forget to capture the before status. If you only assess the status after the service is performed, the impact is not evident. So if you were to assess interview readiness after you provided the interview prep service, but you didn't before capture their readiness before the service, you're not going to really be able to tell the extent to which you've moved the needle. So you need to establish a baseline before the service is provided, then you assess it again to determine the impact. Especially useful when evaluating social determinants of health, which may be more subjective than objective. Okay, just gonna pause here and let you know you are still in the correct webinar. Okay? You are looking at 3 pictures that I'm sharing with you. These are pictures of an organized office closet after it was organized. And I just want you to think about your assessment of this. Would you say that it was organized? Do you feel like it looks good? How do you feel about it? My guess is if I asked you to unmute or put it in the chat, you would all have different evaluations of the status of the organization here. However, if I then show you what it used to look like, the before pictures are now on the top, the pictures I showed you in the previous slide are on the bottom. Now it's pretty obvious that there was something that happened here, right? Huge difference between before and after. Maybe it's not perfect, it's not totally clutter-free, maybe not the way you would organize a closet, but when you look at the before picture, it is very obvious that some work has been done here and it made an impact. That is the point of assessments. If you skip the before step, you are not going to be able to demonstrate the impact that you're having. Okay, your turn. In the chat, please tell me which of these is most relevant in your organization. Of the problems we went over today, not recognized as services, not aware services are being performed, not collecting data to demonstrate outcomes. You can just type in the number or type in the words, that's up to you. I would just like to get some information from you in the audience on what is most relevant of the issues I just reviewed with you. Okay, good. Thank you. All right, we have several, we actually have a handful of pretty much everything, except for no takers on not aware, so that's good. But we do have some not recognized and also some not collected, and an additional comment of not having clean data, which is also very important, right? So, okay, so you do experience the same thing I experienced when I was in a human services organization, and that's what I wanted to validate here. So let's just stay together on this, because this is going to show you as we get into the actual assessments how you can turn those things around. So thank you for participating. Okay, so let's move into the client assessment process. So the first thing you do is you choose or design assessment. You can actually do either or, and I'm going to show you both. Then you conduct the initial assessment. Followed by that, you deliver and document the service, right? One way to have clean data is to document the service. Then you conduct that same assessment again after the service is provided, and you measure the change in outcome between the two assessments. With that in mind, let's look at some examples. All right, the first one I'm going to go over with you is the PHQ-9 depression assessment. I just picked this one because it's one that's out there readily available. I just grabbed it off the internet. You can do the same thing. This is a PDF of the document. So you can use the assessment as is. If you have a system like our Empower system, you can actually recreate it in the system with quite a bit of ease. This is what it looks like, a subset of a screenshot in our system without it being filled out. When you hover over the question mark, it actually gives you the definitions, which I'll show you on this slide. So there's an example there. It shows you what it looks like when the assessment is filled out. This is kind of a simple version of it. It doesn't have the calculation or anything in it, but just to show you kind of the basics of how you could use this with an existing assessment like the PHQ-9. Another existing assessment out there, there's lots of them by the way, but I just picked two today to show you, is the ACE assessment, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Assessment. I have the link at the bottom of this slide in case you want to use a specific one that I found. It's pretty comprehensive. It's actually a couple pages. There's another page of instructions after that, but I'm just showing you the first page. So in our system, I recreated it. Again, this just took minutes to do and showed you a simple score, which is based on how many yeses there are. And again, if you hover over the question mark, you can see what the actual question was that you're answering yes or no to. All right, now I'm going to move into a couple examples of assessments that we created at Continual Care Solutions, just to show you that if you can't find or don't want to use existing assessments that are out there, you can create your own. And so that's what we did here. This is an example of motivation and willingness. I'll tell you right now that this one is available for download, and I'll be reminding you about that at the end of the webinar. But this is the format that you would see in our Empower system, where it has all the categories on the left-hand side and the scoring here on a scale of 1 to 10, which goes from not willing through sometimes willing to consistently willing. You'll see the score here in this example of 44%. And I'm wondering, you're probably sitting there thinking that's probably not a great score. Well, it may or may not be, because again, the important thing is I'm only showing you the one assessment, but if this is the baseline assessment, what is this assessment again? What is the score of this assessment again after the service is provided? That's what makes the difference. So you can see where it moved. The absolute score is relevant, but is not the full story. So you can't really make a conclusion based on just looking at this data because you only have one assessment. So assessments really need to be bookended at least by a second assessment, if not multiple assessments. The second one I'll share with you is the self-sufficiency assessment that has been available for download on our website for some time now. This is what it looks like in our system. We actually have a special deduction on the bottom of the screen. So when I flip to the next slide, you're going to notice that the score changes quite a bit, even though the numbers in the grid itself do not change. So it dropped to 64% because it has a deduction of mental health. So in this format of this assessment, we have we believe that mental health impacts all of the things you see above it in the grid, and that's why the number dropped so much. So that's another option you have in building an assessment, is to have factors that cut across all the categories. And this is a snapshot of the self-sufficiency assessment available for download. It's just a couple of the categories, of full categories that are available for you on our website. And before I move from this, let me just say the other thing about the self-sufficiency assessment, I'm going to back up one just to tell you, if you were to hover over the numbers, you would see the definitions that I'm showing you in this PDF document. And why that's important is you can choose how to design your assessment. Some of them, yes, no's are fairly straightforward, but when it comes to numbers, if everyone on this call was filling out a self-sufficiency assessment for a client, the same client, at the same time, right? We silently had our assessments, we were filling them out. I might think basic needs is a 6, but someone else might pick an 8, right? Because you just think it's an 8. You're like, on a scale of 1 to 10, what are their basic needs assessment? Self-sufficiency. I think it's 7, 6, 5, whatever. We're all gonna probably have different numbers. Maybe they're close together, but they're not the same. When you have a definition like this where it's detailed, it's way more likely that the data consistency will be there. So if we ask, what is this person's self-sufficiency in the category of basic needs, and we read the definition of number 6, which is has food and clothing with limited dependence on public assistance and other subsidies to meet those needs, we're probably all going to say, yes, that's the right one, as opposed to being all over the map. So that's another way for data integrity to ensure that, is to add these definitions in. Okay, here's another example I'm sharing with you with permission from a current customer who uses this assessment for job readiness. So this is in a checklist format. You can see that it's asking whether these things are in place before they start work. Yes, no, or not applicable. So you would be taking this assessment when you first start working with the client, and then after you've provided your service and before they start their work, you would of course take it again to measure whether they are more ready than they were when you first met with them. And then another version of the job readiness, we have the soft skills checklist. So this is similar to the pre-work checklist, except it talks about soft skills, and it's really just yes or no because they're all applicable. On the left-hand side, you see all of them there, or most of them there. There's actually a scroll bar. You might see that in the middle. There's actually quite a few. All the categories you see on the right side where it says soft skills action plan are represented on the left side. You'd have to scroll down in our system to see them. But we have a combination of a checklist and an action plan. So when you fill it out, for example, in the category of dependability, because that's the one that you can see on the screen and below professionalism, you see there's some no's there. Well, the idea is you really want them to be all yeses or mostly yeses. So where there are no's, the first one is about being on time for work appointments and meetings, and it says no. Well, we need to work with that client on that, right? So let's put an action plan down on the right side for what we're going to do to help them increase their dependability. It's another way that you can use these assessments. Okay, as we wrap up the program level assessments, can you please put in the chat what client assessments that you currently use regularly? If you don't know the name of it, just describe it in the chat. And if you don't use any, please put none. All right, I see one self-sufficiency matrix. What else? Again, if you don't use any, please just put none. We're just trying to share with each other where we're at, okay? We have a none, employment readiness, interest survey, satisfaction survey, great. ACEs, PHQ-9, CAGE, variety of those self-reported measures, pre and post skills survey, great. Okay, those are all wonderful things to use, and they can be converted into any kind of assessment format that I showed you today. And a couple more formats I'm going to show you in a second on organizational. All right, thank you for participating in that. Let's move on to organizational. So this is the organizational assessment process. It looks very similar to the client assessment process. There's a few key differences though. So the first two steps are the same. You choose or design an assessment, then you conduct the initial assessment. From that initial assessment, you identify and address priority improvement areas. And then you conduct the assessment again at an established interval. The difference between this and the client was the client assessment is typically done right after the service is performed. In the case of organizational assessments, it's more usually a time-based thing, so that you pick an established interval, whether that be quarterly or annually. It really depends on what you're assessing, how often you can do that. And I'll make a comment on each, when we go through the examples, I'll explain some of the frequencies that I would recommend you use. And you do measure the change and outcome between the first and the last assessment, and you repeat the process. So once you see, okay, what happened between the first and the second one? Okay, did we move the needle? Is it better? Did we address the issues that we said we were going to address? Where we stand today? Okay, now what are our new priority areas that we're going to focus on? Then we take the assessment again and it repeats itself. So that is the organizational process. So let's go through some types and examples. Okay, so first, I'm going to have a couple different types for you and then some examples within those types. I'm going to start with the compliance innovation assessment, which is a grid-based assessment. So this is the type of assessment that I used in most of the assessments I showed you earlier under clients. So this is a grid-based, as you can see. The compliance innovation assessment is something that we created in order to educate your organization on where you stand on the compliance innovation continuum. So we have compliance 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and you can see the definitions there. For all the categories, culture, data integrity, etc. So as you fill this out, similar to the client assessments, you can hover over the word to get a definition, which you may think, well, do I really need that? I mean, doesn't everybody know what unreliable means? Well, they may, but everyone interprets things a little different, so I always recommend a definition if you can. Similarly here, another couple examples, documented and communicated, what does that mean? Typically follow the process as intended. That's pretty clear. Documented and communicated, fairly clear, very clear when you define it. Right, again, more information here. It's hard to say it in one word, but I didn't want to also clutter up the entire grid by cramming in all the definitions. So being able to hover over them to show them is really helpful. So this is called a tooltip, the thing that is showing as a pop-up. Okay, the compliance innovation assessment is now available for you as well. We made it into a PDF in this format that you're seeing there, so you can download it and use that in your organization for free. Okay, sticking with compliance but moving to a different type, we have a survey assessment. So this is the compliance program self-assessment that OMIG offers, Office of Medicaid Inspector General. So those of you, most of you are probably familiar with this. If you are receiving Medicaid dollars, then you are subject to this. This is not a required assessment. I just want to make that point. However, OMIG strongly recommends that you do it. So when I was a compliance officer, I utilized this assessment. It's a Word document from OMIG, but I find it more useful to put it into a system as a survey like ours does, so that you can distribute it to the leadership team and get everybody's input, which is what I did. Get everybody's input ahead of time, and then you come together and you discuss it, which I think is a really great way to have a rich discussion at the leadership level about compliance. So this is an example of a survey assessment. Another survey you're probably pretty familiar with is the employee engagement survey. So this is this example shows you a very basic employee engagement survey. When I talked a little bit earlier about frequency, something like employee engagement, this isn't something that you want to do like monthly. It would be really hard, I think, to move the needle and see any difference in over a monthly basis. That and survey fatigue will set in, and people will stop filling it out, frankly. So you're not going to get the data that you need. So for employee engagement, it's typically something you do annually or potentially semi-annually if you have something big going on, like a big change that you're implementing that you might want to measure. But it's not something you do constantly. That's, again, a key difference between organizational and client assessments, is that organizational are based more on time and what's most appropriate. Similarly, for compliance innovation that I just covered, you're not probably going to change all those things super fast. So maybe, I mean, quarterly would be a lot, frankly. I would say maybe even semi-annually would be better, or annually. But that's something that you can decide in your organization. Here's another type. This is a scorecard. It's just a simple yes or no. Are these things in place or not? And again, you measure this over time. So if you're trying to get at all the yeses, you can see the no's that are captured here. If it's important to you that you have a marketing plan in place, you see that you don't. On the bottom there, the last no is a marketing plan in place and reviewed in the past quarter. It's not. If that's important to you, and by the way, if it's important to you, it should be on the scorecard. If it's not important to you, it should not be on the scorecard, right? So first of all, only put things on there that you care about. And if you do care about it and it says no, then it tells you where you should be focusing your efforts, so that next time you use assessment, hopefully you have a marketing plan in place. And then finally, we have the enterprise risk assessment. So those of you who joined me for the first webinar, I went over this in detail. It is available for download as a document, but I'm showing you a snapshot of it. I left it in this format. I did not recreate it in our system, as it's kind of a sophisticated in the fact that it's kind of 3D, and that you're plotting these items on a matrix. So you're looking at likelihood and impact. So when you're assessing your enterprise risk, you're gathering all the risks that seem to be relevant to your organization. Putting them on a matrix like this is really helpful for you to see which ones are the most important. And in this case, I would say something that is in the top right corner would probably be the most important, because it represents the largest impact and the largest likelihood. So for pandemic, for example, I have it as an impact 9 and likelihood 10, or likelihood 9. You might argue that this it should be 10 and 10 because it's here. It's happening right now, and it's like blowing everybody's lives up. But some of you have fared pretty well, and I decided that I didn't want to quite put it to a 10. But just for illustrative purposes, I want to make sure that was included. In the future, hopefully the pandemic is not on the chart anymore, or at least it's not sitting up at 9 and 9. But that's again why you do this over time. Another example, we'll just go to the other side of the chart where you have employee injury. And this is subjective. Like, I just picked these numbers. If you filled this out, you might decide they're different, and that's okay. It's all relative, but it does give you a nice snapshot in order to assess where things are at and decide what your highest priority risks are that you're going to address. So again, with the employee injury example, I gave it an impact of 3 because it is something that it impacts the individual, but assuming it's not a very serious injury, it's something they typically recover from fairly quickly, and it doesn't on an organizational level have a huge impact, but it does happen fairly frequently. I put it at a 5 because things happen, right? In human services, you're dealing with typically with behaviors or even just slipping in the parking lot, right? So these things do happen, and it's worth capturing it, but it may not be where you want to put your full focus in terms of risk mitigation. All right, last question for you today. If you can put in the chat, what organizational assessments do you already have in place and use at least annually? What organizational assessments do you already have in place and use at least annually? And again, as in with client assessments, if you do not do any organizational assessments, just put none. This is good information to share with your peers. Okay, we have a risk assessment report, annual goals, monthly needs assessment. Great. SWOTs, risk assessment, security assessment, strategy map development. That's all awesome. Agency-wide employee survey, benchmarks, good. Yep, all those are good, and you can use any of the formats that I shared with you, and there's probably others to use. For example, the compliance innovation assessment was really a new thing that we developed, just recognizing that that's maybe not something organizations are really thinking about. And so that's one of the things I love about assessments, is you can get really creative. A couple more we have, let's see, employee engagement risk, risk assessment, yearly performance assessments. Yep, those are also assessments. I would be remiss in not, thank you, Cheryl, for mentioning that, because of course most people do performance reviews. Those are assessments. in that they have a before and after, right? You assess them if it's on an annual basis, it's typically the same form, or it should be to be consistent. So that's a great example of an assessment as well. Great. Yes, thank you all for your participation in that. So, all right, so these tools are available for download. Self-sufficiency and the enterprise risk assessment were previously available to you, but now we've added 2 more, the motivation willingness assessment that I shared with you today, as well as the compliance innovation assessment. And you can get that under our resources section on our website. So now we're at the Q&A section. You can put your question in the chat. If it's more extensive, you can unmute and just ask it. I do want to point out that I did write a related blog post on this topic regarding assessments uncovering new funding opportunities. That is where I took the bulk of the material for the beginning part of the presentation, where I went through the 3 problems, but there is more detail on the blog post, so I encourage you to check that out if you haven't already read it. So with that, I will turn it over to you to ask any questions that you have. Or comments. You can offer comments. Anything you'd like to discuss. I'll give it a minute for you to warm up. All right, while I'm waiting for you to jump in, I would just do a pre-submitted question on how many assessments should I be using? So that, you probably know the answer already, but I think it's a good question. The answer is it depends, as always, right? So it's really about what you want to measure. I think anytime you want to measure something, it's worthwhile to have an assessment. There's no magic number of assessments. I would say greater than 0. Because if you're not using them, you are missing out on a huge opportunity to determine, demonstrate, document, and share your outcomes. Okay. Do you have any suggestions for assessing COVID-related risks for an organization? Yes, certainly. So in terms of assessing it, I think it has to do with, you can use a couple different tools, but I'm thinking of the enterprise risk assessment, but more doing that through the lens of COVID. So where I had the enterprise risk assessment in the pandemic was just one item on the enterprise risk assessment, I would do a separate COVID-related risk and really generate a list with your leadership team or anyone other interested stakeholder. What are all the risks that are specific to this pandemic for us? And then I would plot them on that enterprise risk matrix assessment. Okay, Cheryl says, we are instilling assessments needing to be done with clients initially and then quarterly or next contact with the client, whichever comes first. I'm glad you mentioned that, Cheryl, because one thing I'd recommend is taking advantage of the established meetings you have with clients. If you have an annual review or a 6-month review or whatever it is, don't look for an artificial reason to do an assessment, right? Certainly after the service is performed, before and after is really important. But in terms of self-sufficiency, for example, every time you meet with them, do another assessment, right? You already have them captive audience, they have them in front of you, do that assessment. So it's probably a good time to think about, I've got them now, what is all the information I need from them, get it then, and then get it again every time that you meet with them regularly. All right, anything else? Just give it a couple more seconds. Okay, well, this is not your only opportunity to ask questions. You can always reach me. It's Stephanie@continualcaresolutions.com. You can reach out to my colleagues as well. Connect with me on LinkedIn. We'd love to chat with you about this topic or anything that you want to talk about. And I would like to invite you to the last webinar series of 2020, which is Succession Planning, Prepare Leaders for Tomorrow. I have to tell you that as much as I love the first 2 topics, succession planning is the one I am most passionate about because it ties all of my previous experiences as human resources professional and developing succession planning and leadership development programs. And I'm going to be sharing all of that with you, including, of course, how to leverage that great data you get from the process in order to make strategic decisions and prepare leaders for tomorrow. So don't miss it. If you have a conflict as with this webinar and the other, certainly still register for it, because you can get the recording afterward along with any materials that we make available to you. With that, I thank you very much for your time and hope to see you next time. Everyone have a great day.